So we're delighted to have with us Andrew Dunlop, Lord Dunlop, who is a member of the House of Lords and, of course, a member of the Constitution Committee, particularly. Before that, he was a Minister of State in the Northern Ireland office and in the Scotland office, but crucially was also a key advisor to David Cameron on Scotland and the Union, including in the run-up to and the immediate aftermath of the referendum in 2014. So delighted to have you with us and look forward to getting a sense from you of what you think the key issues facing the Union are. I think if we start with that broader question about what you think the state of the Union is, I mean, how would you characterize it?
Well, I think everybody is apt to run around with their sort of hair on fire because of, bad opinion polls in Scotland. And there's no doubt about it, the opinion polls we've seen in Scotland have not been great. But I think you need to sort of dig beneath the kind of headline figures. And actually, I think what matters to people in Scotland at the moment is, their health and their jobs, and how do we recover from COVID? And that's their priority. And I see that as a kind of opportunity for those of us who want to see Scotland strengthened within the United Kingdom. And that's what we should all be sort of focusing on.
Do you think that there are particular opportunities that arise from dealing with the post-Brexit and the post-COVID rebuild? I mean, one of the things we've talked a lot about to people is how this has been the first crisis since the beginning of devolution where the fault lines in what's devolved and what isn't, and who's responsible for what, and what needs to be done on a UK level. Do you think that provides a sort of an opportunity to reset and rethink as we go forward?
I do. I mean, I very much see this as a sort of moment of renewal for the country. As you say, we've been through the trauma of Brexit, and we're just beginning to come out of the trauma of COVID. Although the recovery from COVID is there's going to be a very long tail to that, I think. And so I think that is an opportunity for us to look again at how the United Kingdom is working. And certainly so far as devolution is concerned, I think the most interesting thing about, if you like, or one of the interesting things that's come out of the COVID pandemic is, for the first time, I think people have realized the sort of reality of devolution. And for some people, that's come as quite a shock. For those of us who have been involved for a long time, no shock at all. But I think it has really brought home to people that the decisions that the UK government take and the devolved governments take, for those decisions to be effective, they depend on each other. So really my focus would be, how do we make sure that devolution is working as well as it possibly can and working for all parts of the United Kingdom?
Do you think that the system, the devolution and central government, has worked during COVID?
I think it started off quite well. And why did it work quite well? It's because the leaders of the devolved governments were involved around the table with UK government ministers. So they were involved in COBRA, and we had these ministerial implementation groups. And then, for reasons which are not entirely clear, come June time, those meetings became less and less frequent. And I think the leaders of the devolved institutions felt less involved. And it was about that time that we began to see divergence occur. More recently, we've seen, Michael Gove in the run-up to Christmas, very active in, negotiating a Christmas agreement. It was overtaken by events. So it's been very much a sort of curate's egg, I think. To begin with, it worked well. Then we went through a period when it didn't work very well. So I think we need to draw lessons from that and recognize that because of the division of labor and responsibility, we need much stronger machinery that allows the different governments in the United Kingdom to come together and take decisions jointly.
No, absolutely, and I think we'll come on to that, because I think that was quite a big theme of the report that you were commissioned to write just over 18 months ago. From your experience in government in the Scotland and the Northern Ireland office, I mean, away from the high level First Minister and Prime Minister relationships, do you think that COVID, and actually Brexit as well, was a bit of a culture shock for the civil service in understanding where the dividing lines were and what levers they could and couldn't pull on a UK-wide basis?
Well, Fraser, I mean, you worked in the centre of government, so you probably know the answer to that. And I think we always used to have a sort of private sort of list of who was on the naughty step in terms of Whitehall departments and who were top of the class. And there were definitely some departments. DEFRA, I think, was always very good in terms of understanding devolution because it was part of their day-to-day work. But Department for Education, Department for Health, that have obviously been very prominent in the COVID crisis, and the ministry whose name I can never get right, but Ministry for Housing and Local Government and Communities, they've had a bit of a wake-up call, I think, during this crisis. And I suppose that sort of illustrates the basic point. There's been lots of debate. Do we need a kind of department for the union? And I don't think that is the answer, because actually what we need is a government for the union. We need the whole of Whitehall to think about implications of devolution and the implications for the union at a much earlier stage as they're developing policy. I fear that at the moment, and certainly my own experience was, in the right round process that you had as part of the collective decision-making process, it was always right at the end of the process, that the Scotland office or the Northern Ireland office or the Wales office got to hear about something, when almost it was too late to influence the decision. And so really, my view is we need a culture change within Whitehall, a change of mindset. And that's not easy to achieve. You can, shift the structures about, but changing culture is a much harder thing to do and requires a whole series of measures to make it stick.
Yeah. So some of those measures may or may not be found in an as yet unpublished report that you were commissioned to write in the final weeks of the Theresa May government. I was looking back at the terms of reference for that, and it described itself as a short and focused report that would look at the UK government structures for how best to support the union. It wouldn't look at whether or not the powers of the devolved administrations and legislatures needed radical change. It was very focused on what the government needed to do to get its own house in order. There's still been no sight of that report more than 18 months later, but there have been reports, and you just touched on one of them, that there's been a recommendation of a cabinet minister for the union. The Cabinet Office, through a source in response to that story, said that there would be movement towards that direction of travel, or certainly towards the direction of travel of your recommendations. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. I think. Obviously, I've been keeping close touch with how policy is being developed in government, and certainly, I think both the public and private line regarding my report is, well, yes, it hasn't been sort of published yet, but we're getting on and implementing many of the recommendations. And to me, that's what matters. It's the recommendations I've made. I want to influence what the government does, and that's the most important thing. And I certainly see signs that they are doing that. I think the fact that sort of Michael Gove has taken on a kind of role, overarching role, to look at the union, I think is a step in the right direction. My concern about that would be is that Michael Gove, able guy that he is the go-to man for lots of issues, and it seems to me the integrity of the United Kingdom is of such importance that it justifies a senior cabinet minister devoting, much of their time to thinking about how do we improve the way the United Kingdom works. So I would like to see, if you like, existing practice go further. I was encouraged that the Prime Minister has decided to chair this new Union Strategy Committee, because as you will know, Fraser, if something is important to the Prime Minister, then it will become important to Whitehall. So I saw that as a positive move forward, and certainly one of my other recommendations was to have a specific cabinet committee looking at the union, and that was really to address what I saw as a big failing, that there would be a great sort of strategic discussion about the importance of the union, and everybody agreed it was important. But then where was the follow through? Departments would scurry off, look at what they were already doing, try and rebadge it as kind of union activity, and then present it to the Prime Minister. But that isn't what I'm talking about. I'm talking about thinking creatively and proactively about how do we improve the condition of the United Kingdom in its totality.
Yeah. So you would like to see a sort of big figure coordinating the work on the union, working presumably with the Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland Secretaries of State, but having that as their main job plugged into the centre of government, the Cabinet Office.
Yes, I think that's right. I always had a sort of motto when I was in government. Do the opposite of what the SNP are calling for. And one of the things the SNP was calling for was the abolition of the Scotland office. And you should think about, well, why were they calling for that? Now, it's absolutely true that the territorial offices are some of the smallest and least influential within Whitehall. But rather than sweep them away, the focus of my report is how could you really focus their activity and give them influence, working with a senior sort of figure to actually ginger up the way Whitehall thinks about the union and devolution in particular.
Yeah, no, that certainly chimes with my experience of working with the territorial offices. Moving on to devolution itself, Anne has a couple of questions about how that's developed in the last few years.
Yeah, Andrew, Fraser was touching on the demarcation of the devolved settlement and people's understanding of it through this crisis. One of the phenomenons that we've seen, particularly in Wales, is a growth in scepticism towards devolution, particularly from those who are most supportive of the union. Have you been concerned at all by that rise in Devo scepticism? And what do you think it means?
That's a very good question, and I've been looking at the polls in Wales, and there seems to be a bit of a sort of polarization. Some of the polls have seen a big increase in independence, and some an increase in, as you call it, Devo scepticism. But I think in a sense, what I'm talking about is that sort of middle ground. And if you like, I think the way to both answer the independence rise and the rise in Devo's scepticism is actually to make devolution work better. And I'm not saying the way devolution works is perfect, and I'm not calling for more powers to be devolved, because I don't think that's the answer. I equally don't think the answer is trying to sort of turn back the clock on devolution. Devolution has happened, and unless you correct me, I think the majority of people in Wales regard devolution as being a good thing. So I would be really focusing on making sure, as I say, that devolution is working as well as it can. And I think that involves recognizing that there are overlaps in competence between the UK government and the devolved governments. And, you know, rather than having what we have at the moment, which is machinery that's really very unsatisfactory, it's fractious, consultative information sharing, whereas we've got to accept the reality of the situation. There are now vast areas that require governments across the United Kingdom to work together and to take decisions together. And that is quite new, really. And that's what we need to wake up to, I think.
Do you sense part of that change needs to come from the political parties' makeup as well? So the Scottish Conservatives, prior to Ruth Davidson's election as leader, did review their structures and did try to reflect much more the settlement of devolution in Scotland. Wales hasn't quite caught up with that. So we still have this situation where there isn't really a nominated leader. That still remains the leader of the Conservatives or the Prime Minister. And so part of the reflection of the devolved settlement within the party structure creates its own problems. Do you think that's something that the party could fix fairly easily?
Well, I think it's something definitely worth looking at. And I mean, I don't know the details, but I think I'm right in saying is that the party did commission a kind of review of all of that in Wales. I haven't seen the results of it. I don't even, maybe I've sort of, great revelation, said something I shouldn't have said, but I certainly think it's being looked at. And I would argue that you know, if you like, the reforms that were made to the Scottish Party have been very sort of beneficial. You know, it hasn't been a branch office of London. It's had a life of its own. And I think, you know, that creative tension, if you like, has been a good thing in terms of how the party is operating and positioning itself in Scotland. And I certainly think the same thing could benefit Wales.
We've spoken to Vernon Bogdanor and John Curtis, amongst others, recently. And one of the things that Professor Bogdanor told us was that he feels that there's a need for a clearly defined charter now, which sets out what is devolved and what isn't, as a means to drawing a line under the constant discussion over powers. Is that something that you think carries weight, or is it something that looks good on paper but potentially doesn't really work in our political system?
Well, I'm not sure really what you know his charter really means, if I'm honest. I mean, I think, you know, we have written down in various places, you know, where powers lie. You know, so bringing it together in a single document, you know, I'm not sure that would advance us very much. I think far more important is, you know, the stories we tell about the United Kingdom. You know, the campaign against Scottish independence in 2014 was called Better Together, and you know, that was a superb title for a campaign, because that is the question we repeatedly have to answer. You know, why are we better together? And that is a narrative that constantly needs to be refreshed. And if we're talking about it in a Scottish context, it's not just about saying to Scotland why they benefit, or Scotland benefits from being within the United Kingdom, but it's why the United Kingdom benefits from having Scotland within it. And that's the task I think we need to, I would say, was more important than bringing together in some charter, you know, what is already written down anyway. That would be my view.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting, because what John Curtis told us was that the biggest weakness that the union cause has in all of the polls and research that he's been carrying out is the fact that there isn't a unified story at the moment. So the fact that the Conservatives and Labour are not working in tandem to make a case for the union is a weak point. Is there a sense that there needs to be a quick reassessment of how you make that case? And is it different, do you feel, to how things were dealt with back in 2014 and the preparations that you were carrying out then?
Well, I'm encouraged that actually the sorts of things I'm talking about and thinking about, within a conservative context, are pretty similar to what Gordon Brown has been thinking about and talking about. So whilst you say, what the Conservatives are doing, what Labour are doing, what the Lib Dems are doing is all kind of separate, I don't think that's quite true. I think the people who are thinking about the union, I'm talking about outside government. I think there's a lot of cross-party conversation going on, and what encourages me actually is not the differences, it's the degree of common ground there is. I mean, I took part in a discussion, I think it was last week, and we had a great range of people, from Nick Timothy, who has a particular view within the Conservative Party, to John Denham. We had somebody from the Democratic Unionist Party, and whilst there may have been differences about very long-term, direction of travel, I think a lot of agreement in the short to medium term, what it is that those of us who want to see a strong United Kingdom created and strengthened, I think huge amounts of agreement. So I'm pretty encouraged by that.
And finally, from me, every week we have a section in our newsletter which we call Metroland, where we try to look at actually the devolution which is taking place in England. And whilst it's not comparable in many ways to the national approach that we've seen in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, it's clear that there has been a step change in how England thinks about its own governance structures. Do you think that that is the answer to the English problem, as it were? Because many people have always tried to figure out what you do with England in any type of devolved situation. Is it what we have with the Metro mayors?
Well, I mean, I've written about this myself, and I am a great supporter of devolution within England. I mean, I think the difficulty is that when Labour were in power, that was a sort of top-down process, creating very artificial constructs, which ultimately were rejected, famously in the referendum in the Northeast. So I think this is a sort of bottom-up process, and rather than officials and ministers in Whitehall having a grand master plan, it's the UK central government as a stimulator and facilitator to use its levers to encourage local sort of communities to come together and to create, if you like, the structures to operate that sort of devolution at local level in England. Now, I don't think symmetry and tidiness should be an end in itself. I think far more important, how do we address the regional inequality, economic inequalities in England? And if that's best done by a slightly untidier process, but one that feels more natural to the people who are involved in it, that seems to me the right way forward.
Thank you very much.
If I could just finish looking back to Scotland, and we're getting closer and closer to the elections to the Scottish Parliament. And while this is a big week for the SNP in terms of other things that are happening in Holyrood, there has been a sense that it is inevitable that the SNP will be returned either with a majority on their own or with other independence parties. Now, if that does happen, what do you think the UK government's reaction should be when there is a request for a Section 30 order, as there was in the run-up to the 2014 referendum? And do you think that a second independence referendum is inevitable, or that it can be held off with some of the measures that you and others have talked about?
I certainly don't believe that another independence referendum is inevitable. And, you know, I was always taught never to answer hypothetical questions. So I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that there will be an independence majority after May. And I think what's been interesting, I mean, I don't think unionists should bank on the Salmond imbroglio to sort of bail them out. But I think, you know, what we've seen in polls in recent days is actually the margins between, you know, the SNP getting a sort of pro-independence majority in the parliament and not are very thin. And, you know, we all know that parties that look divided, you know, do face a price at the ballot box. So I think we're very much getting into the territory where, yes, it's the most probable outcome is an SNP kind of majority, or at least an independence majority. But, you know, we've got some way to go until the election. So I don't think it's any, you know, a foregone conclusion by any means. But should it occur, I think the government's got to do what's right for the country. And what's right for the country, including Scotland, is to focus on how we recover from the biggest crisis that we faced in our lifetimes. And I think people in Scotland will understand that, because after all, that's what they're telling opinion polls is what matters to them. And frankly, I don't think the SNP is prepared, despite what they're saying, is prepared for another independence referendum. They've done no thinking since 2014 about their independence prospectus that I can see. So I think, personally, I think it suits both parties to have a period focusing on other things. Now, that's not to rule out or to you know, deny Scotland its self-determination if a majority of Scots want that. But I think, you know, what we're going to be focusing on for the foreseeable future is recovery, health and economic, from this crisis that we've just been through.
Yeah, well, there'll be certainly a lot to do on all those fronts. Lord Dunlop, thank you again for taking the time to speak to us. It's been fascinating, and we'd love to have you on again at some point, maybe even once your report has been published.
Okay.
Thank you again for taking the time.
Thanks very much.